Okay, the parts of the brain, structure of the brain. Brain has all these functions. We know all this, um, but the parts of the brain are maybe things we don't know as much about. And you know, you could take an entire course on the brain, or an entire year of courses on the brain, and still not know everything. But this is just to give you an idea of that there are different parts and what those different parts do. So we've got these major areas: the cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, brainstem. We'll go over those. But even within these major areas, we've got um, the different lobes or different functional areas, different association areas. And for each person, it's not necessarily true that the same square millimeter of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum does the exact same thing as someone else. But it's just that things generally happen in that area. Okay, so let's get over that gross structure of the brain. So you've got the brain has these two hemispheres. Well, as far as the cerebrum, talking about the cerebrum. So the cerebrum has these two hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And a lot of people understand that generally what happens on the right side of the body is controlled or sent to the left side of the brain, and vice versa. But that's not 100% true. It's not always true that the left side controls everything the right side does. There's always exceptions. But for the cerebrum, the left and right sides do communicate through the corpus callosum. And so this corpus callosum, we'll see it a little bit better in the next picture. Actually, we just go now. Here's that corpus callosum right here. That's going to allow the left side of the brain to talk to the right side of the brain. So the hemispheres are separated by something called the longitudinal fissure. Runs down the center of the brain. We've got these structures called gyri, or singular gyrus. And a gyrus is just a bump on the brain. Maybe convolution's a better word, but they're the bumpy parts. And then we've got the sulci, or singular sulcus, which are the grooves that are in that gray matter. There's a central sulcus here, and it's a little easier to see it here. The central sulcus, in some of the older textbooks, you'll see it called the central sulcus of Rolando. Separates some of the hemispheres. There's a lateral sulcus also. Lateral sulcus separating the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. There's the transverse fissure, and this transverse fissure separates the cerebellum, smaller part of the brain, from the cerebrum. Okay, let's talk a little bit about these different lobes, different areas. So we've got the frontal lobe here, and the great thing is, since you learned all of the bones in A&P 1, you now know all of the lobes. So you've got the frontal lobe, parietal lobes, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Okay? All right. And then this picture, like we already looked at, just shows that central sulcus, or that corpus callosum. The other one, it's a little easier to see here, is this insula. The insula is a deeper portion of the cerebrum, and the insula, it's not really well understood everything it does, but one of the things it does, it has some association areas for taste. um, all within the cerebrum, though, especially these areas. You're going to have things like um, initiating voluntary movements, storing information as memories, um, retrieving that stored information, reasoning, and then this the cerebrum. This is where our intelligence comes from. This is where our personality comes from, if you have one. If you don't, it's probably in there somewhere. Some people have more than one, and it's fine. Okay, here's that frontal lobe, parietal lobes, occipital lobe, and that temporal lobe. Okay, and there's the insula. Functional regions of the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is just this very thin layer of gray matter. That's the outermost portion of the cerebrum. So this is the cerebral cortex, this very thin layer, a few millimeters thick of the cerebral cortex. Even though it's this thin layer of gray matter, and remember gray matter is the nervous tissue that's not myelinated, it has 75% of all the neurons in the nervous system. So 3/4 of all the neurons in the nervous system are found in this cerebral cortex. Okay, and then this has some of those areas. Now, as we go through this and realize I'm going to talk, but a lot of this stuff is already written down right here for you in this table. Okay. And that table it's 11.5 on this, but in your book, it is 11.3, and it's on page 402. Okay. So there we go. So these this prefrontal cortex, and this is just where we send out signals to the skeletal muscles, and it's called the prefrontal motor cortex. This is the sensory area that's involved with the feeling stuff, especially feelings from our skin, but getting sensations to the brain from the PNS. And like we said before, it's not like this very specific portion of the frontal lobe is the only place we do concentration, planning, and problem solving, but it's kind of the general area that we do it. Okay. Auditory area, Broca's area is where we have our motor speech. Sometimes people have strokes and they can't speak afterwards, and that's a pretty good indication that the Broca's area was injured. Not surprisingly, in the temporal lobe, we've got where we interpret auditory patterns. Now remember, temporal lobe, your ears are right here. So it's a good thing that's right there. Sensory speech area here, parietal lobe. Visual area is in the occipital lobe, and it's kind of where we take in all these images. So your eyes are up here, and the signal has to go all the way back to the occipital lobe to be processed. Okay, and then just look through this, get an idea. Add this to your notes. Okay, so sensory area, the post-central sulcus here. It's in the parietal lobe. And this is, we already said, getting those interpretations from the skin. Um, let's see. Where else can we put? Oh, you know what? The sensory area for taste is near the base of the central sulcus, so kind of way down there. And then other one we didn't mention. Oh, sensory areas for smell. That happens much deeper in the cerebrum, and so it's not here, but the sensory areas for smell happen deeper in the cerebrum. And since it does happen deeper in the cerebrum, think about, if you could pick one sense that really stimulates other senses, it's really the sense of smell. When you smell something, let's just pick a good smell, like, you smell a pie baking. It brings up so many other, memories, maybe your grandmother baking a pie, or, but it also stimulates other parts of your body, like causes you to salivate, unless you don't like pie. So, these little homunculi, or homunculus, this shows the where in that parietal lobe that you're getting those, sorry, maybe over here, where you're getting those senses. So go back here. So what we're talking about is right here on this, this post-central gyri, and that's this right here. So down towards the temporal lobe, we have, this is where we pick up senses from the tongue and pharynx and teeth and gums. Hands, fingers, arms, pelvis, thigh, toes, feet, legs, genitals, all those senses are being processed right here. And then in the motor area, we can just do the motor area while we're right here. In the motor area, notice that if this is the motor area, and we're looking at now these gyri, that the place where we cause salivation to happen, or chewing or swallowing, it's also the place where we're getting those senses. So when you feel food in the back of your mouth and on your tongue, we also can chew that food. Where you feel your hands and fingers and thumbs is also right next to, adjacent to, where you can move those. Okay, and then pelvis, thigh, legs, so where you feel your feet and your toes here is also where you can move them. All right, that's just showing that sensory area. Notice that's the central sulcus right here, and this is the superior view. Let's see, is there anything we haven't talked about with this one? Not really. I think pretty much talked about all of these. If not, just check it out in the book, or look at your notes from your reading. Okay, now these are just general association areas for the frontal lobe, or for the lobes. First general one we've got in the frontal lobe association area is where we have concentrating, planning, complex problem solving. Now, the frontal lobe is one of the last places to fully develop in people, and in especially boys, this doesn't even really fully develop until early 20s to mid 20s. And so for those teenage boys, it's quite often People are often like, oh, frontal lobe immaturity when they do something stupid. But the frontal lobe is developed enough that you can. It shouldn't be an excuse, but yeah, the frontal lobe in a teenage boy isn't fully developed, so it's not surprising that sometimes they have trouble concentrating, planning, um, thinking about the consequences of their actions, or other things. Now, years ago, there was a court case where a defense attorney tried to say that because this teenage boy had an underdeveloped frontal lobe because it hadn't matured yet, that's why he shouldn't be held accountable for whatever he did. And it didn't quite work out, but it was just an interesting use of science. Parietal lobe association areas. This is where we're understanding speech, and also in the parietal lobe, we're also figuring out which words to choose to express some thought. Temporal lobe is when we get a lot of the complex signals are being interpreted. But that's because of what's stored there. So this is a place where we store the memories of things like things we've seen, or music we've heard, or complex patterns. And if you've seen someone trying to think of something and they can't quite remember it, notice that they scratch the side of their head, kind of where their temporal lobe is. Or sometimes you see people like lightly knocking on that part. And that's just a very interesting thing to watch people do when they're trying to figure something out, and they're like lightly scratching that part of their head, because really they're using that part of their brain to try to recall those memories. Occipital lobe, we talked about, it's where visual information is processed, but it's really how that visual information is processed with other sensory experiences. So we add in the other stuff we're doing. All right, primary motor area, we kind of talked about this, and that precentral sulcus. Frontal lobes, we've got the primary motor areas, how we control the skeletal muscles. Broca's area is usually in the left hemisphere, and it controls the muscles that we need to cause speech to happen. Frontal eye field is above the Broca's area, and it controls the voluntary movement of eyes and eyelids. So there's that motor area. Same picture, we already talked about this. Hemisphere dominance, usually one hemisphere is more dominant in people than the other. In most people, the left hemisphere is dominant, which accounts for why most people are right-handed. Dominant hemisphere controls how we speak, also why the Broca's area is in the left hemisphere for most people, all this stuff. Non-dominant, all this stuff. Memory. Short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory is just our working memory. It's a closed neuronal circuit. And it means that the circuit has to be stimulated over and over and over and over to keep the memory going. And if you see someone trying to remember something, how they just kind of keep repeating it over and over and over, as soon as you stop stimulating that circuit, the memory also goes away, unless the memory has entered long-term memory through some memory consolidation. Long-term memory changes the physical structure of the brain, changes the structure or the function of a neuron. Okay, so it creates, long-term memory is created when synapses are made from one area to another. And if you think about it, and this is a huge oversimplification, but if you think about the brain and the areas of the brain as like these cubby holes, Remember in kindergarten you had cubby holes where you put stuff? And there's different cubby holes in the brain. And they're all over the place. So when we want to remember something, we have to make connections in those cubby holes, because we may have some memory of something in our brain. I don't know, pick something. So I'll pick the word nucleus. So you know what a nucleus is. But if you remember, nucleus, there's nucleus in cells, there's nucleus in atoms, and you may remember the first time you heard the word nucleus or some other use of it. When we memorize things, when we talk about the nucleus, for example, let's say protons. Protons are found in the nucleus. Now, some of you are like, I have no memory of this whatsoever. Well, maybe you will answer today. Some of you are like, yeah, I kind of remember this. That kind of remembering is that you have a weak kind of a weak connection. That's why I'm making a dotted line, because it's weak. Connection, connecting the parts of your brain where you know what a proton is with what an atom is, with what a nucleus. Now maybe you have a pretty strong connection between your proton memories and atom memories. But as we sit here and I keep talking about this, it makes these connections a little bit stronger. And eventually you'll remember that a proton is part of part of the nucleus of an atom, and this connection will be much stronger. And making these connections, making these pathways happens when we keep accessing the information over and over and over. So, and in science, we call that studying. Studying. And studying is really just kind of walking this pathway back and forth. You keep studying, you read about it, you hear it, you watch a video on it, you write it down, you use flashcards. That's what studying is. And the more you study, the stronger this connection becomes. Now, if you don't use it for a long time, the connection can become weaker. Some things, though, are just, they're there. For example, the alphabet. You learn the alphabet when you were a little kid, probably started when you were 2.5, 3, and then hopefully by age 5 or 6 you knew the alphabet. So now if I say to you, can you say the alphabet? You'll be like, yeah, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, right? It's easy. But if I say to you, what letter comes after Q? You actually have to think about it. Not for long, but you do go Q, R, S, R, okay, in your brain. Everyone in here knows 1 + 1 = 2. You know that. But you don't necessarily know what 32 divided by 3/16 is. But you can figure it out. So you have a memory of what 1 + 1 is. You know that. You don't have to do that. You're not doing the math. That's a memory. But 32 divided by 3/16 is not a memory. But you can do the math. Or you could look up how to do the math. Okay, so that's what memory is. Short-term memory is just working memory. We've got to say it over and over and over. Long-term memory, we've actually changed these transmissions, changed these synapses in the brain. All right, stop here for part 2.